For our short Bible study today, we're going to look at Proverbs chapter 3, verses 1 through 8. We'll leave those last verses there for another Bible study. So let's start reading there in chapter 3 of Proverbs, beginning in verse 1, and we'll read down through the 8th verse. It says, "My son, do not forget my teaching, but let your heart keep my commandments. For length of days and years of life and peace they will add to you. Let not steadfast love and faithfulness forsake you. Bind them around your neck, write them on the tablet of your heart, so you will find favor and good success in the sight of God and man. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your paths. Be not wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord, and turn away from evil. It will be healing to your flesh and refreshment to your bones." Here in these 8 verses in Proverbs chapter 3, we want to look at it really in 2 sections. Verse 1 through 4, you see in part the beginning of trusting God, And then in verse 5 through 8, you see the benefit of trusting God. Indeed, there are many benefits to trusting God, and you see some of those benefits in the first 4 verses just as well. In verses 1 through 4, as I said, we see the beginning of trusting God. And as a father to his son, so Solomon writes here. Solomon speaks of his own commands in the same way that he speaks of the Lord's commands. Why is that? Well, it's because the commands that Solomon is teaching to his son, those are the commands of the Lord. Solomon had committed himself in the writing of Proverbs to teach his sons the commands of God. This teaches us a valuable lesson that the home really is the beginning place of godly instruction. The home is the beginning place of godly instruction. The father teaching his children is the very beginning. It's the very starting point of a person learning the commands of God. It's the way that God designed life to work, is for learning to trust him and learning his commands to begin there in the home. So then Solomon writes, "My son, do not forget my teaching, but let your heart keep my commandments." You see, the commandments of Solomon were the commands of God. That Solomon had adopted the commands of God as his own, and so he passes those on to his children here. And he says here as a benefit, he says, you let your heart keep those commands, for length of days and years of life and peace they will add to you. Indeed, obeying the commands of God is a great source of peace in our life. It keeps us from so many dangers. It keeps us from so many troubles. And ultimately, it keeps us from the greatest and eternal trouble of being separated from all the goodness of God in eternity. Obeying the commands of God, it does prolong a person's life in a sense. It prolongs a person's life in the natural order of things because it keeps them from danger. It keeps them from dangers that would end their life early. But also, obedience to the commands of God, as it comes from a heart of faith and trusting in the Lord, that is the reward that God gives to a person is everlasting life. It is the eternal lengthening of days when a person believes in the Lord in such a way that faith prompts them to live a life of obedience to God. And so, there are many things that people do to prolong their life, and of all that mankind does to prolong his life, you think of fitness training, you think of diet, you think of all sorts of medical advancements and things like that, of all that man does to prolong his life. The sad thing is, the one thing that most people neglect in looking to prolong their life is attention and obedience to the Lord and his commands. The one thing that we are promised in Scripture that adds to life and adds peace to life is the one thing that most people neglect, and that ought not be so. The Apostle Paul in 1 Timothy 4, verse 8, he acknowledges that taking care of the body is good, but that there's a greater thing that we ought to take care of. He says this, 1 Timothy 4:8, "For while bodily training is of some value, godliness is of value in every way, as it holds promise for the present life and also for the life to come." So then, Solomon continues in verse 3 of Proverbs 3. He says, "Let not steadfast love and faithfulness forsake you. Bind the commands around your neck. Write them on the tablet of your heart." Solomon speaks figuratively here about the commands of God being bound around the neck. He's not specifically or literally talking about wearing a necklace or writing literally on the tablet of one's heart. He's saying keep these commands, keep the commands of God ever in your mind, always in your mind, always in your heart. And so then, verse 4, so you will find favor and good success in the sight of God and man. When we live a life of obedience to God's command, not only results in certain kinds of successes in life, but it also results in respect and honor from our fellow man. Ultimately, the greatest example of this is Jesus. As Jesus was born into the world and grew up living a full life, it says of Jesus in those early years in Luke chapter 2, verse 52, it says, "And Jesus increased in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and man." How did Jesus do this? Well, he perfectly obeyed every command of God and lived his life in perfect wisdom before God. Now, there are great benefits to trusting in God. Yes, there's good success that is granted and achieved by the person who lives according to the commands of God. Good success in the sight of God and man. There's also some other benefits, and you see those in verses 5 through 8. It says in verse 5 of Proverbs 3, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your paths." To acknowledge the Lord, it's the Hebrew verb yadah. It means a number of things, a number of ways to conceive knowing someone or something. In this way, in this context, yadah means to accept someone to be what is claimed. And here in Proverbs 3, Solomon tells his son to acknowledge God in all of his ways, that is, in all of his life, to not trust in his own self, to not lean on his own understanding, but to trust in the Lord with all his heart. And in every aspect of life, in every decision in life, to believe God and to believe his commands, to accept God for what he has claimed to be, to trust his word, to obey his word. You know, in our world, we hear people say things all the time like, go with your gut instinct, go with your first reaction, trust yourself, trust your heart. The fact is, the Bible teaches us the exact opposite of that. We're told in verse 5 here to trust in the Lord with all our heart and lean not on our own understanding. And that's the way that our path is made straight, a path of righteousness. In Jeremiah 17, verse 9, we read that the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it? So we're not to trust in our own heart. We're to trust in the Lord with all our heart. And he says in verse 7, "Be not wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and turn away from evil." So many troubles and so many heartaches and difficulties come to us in life, not because of the calamity of evil just hitting us. It comes from trusting ourselves. It comes from being wise in our own eyes, from going with our gut instinct or just reacting. And then we receive the due penalty for our bad reactions, our evil reactions, from trusting our own heart. Here, Solomon says, don't be wise in your own eyes. Just fear the Lord, respect the Lord, give him the due respect, obey his commands, and turn from evil. In Isaiah 5:21, it says, "Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and shrewd in their own sight." we ought to have a bit of humility about ourselves and understand that we don't know everything. In fact, we know very little. Even the smartest among us, even the wisest among us, knows very little. And the best that we can do is say, I don't know near as much as I'd like to think I do, but the Lord knows everything. And the Lord has given me His word, and He's given me His commands, and it's wisdom for me to just trust the Lord and obey Him. We see this kind of humility spoken of by the psalmist in Psalm 131:1. It says, O Lord, my heart is not lifted up. My eyes are not raised too high. I do not occupy myself with things too great and too marvelous for me. What a wonderful, humble way to speak and to think. In fact, we're warned again in Galatians chapter 3, for if anyone thinks he is something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. What a wonderful warning for us to not think of ourselves as something and as someone to be listened to. No, we ought to be humble. And we ought not try to occupy ourselves with things too great and too marvelous for ourselves. We ought to depend and trust in the Lord with all our heart. There's a great outcome to this. It says in verse 8, it will be healing to your flesh and refreshment to your bones. That is, trusting in the Lord with all of our being, that will be healing to our body and refreshment to our bones. You know, we're told here to trust in the Lord and not to trust in ourselves. We've seen that the heart is deceitful and wicked above all things, and that the best and the most right thing and wise thing we can do is to trust the Lord. Now, it takes faith to do this because our own natural inclination is to trust ourselves first. But in the book of Proverbs, twice over, in Proverbs 14, verse 12, and in chapter 16, verse 25, the very same thing is written twice over. It says, there is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way to death. There's a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way to death. The reality is that in life, all of us have trusted our own self. All of us have committed evil. All of us have sinned against God and not rendered to Him the proper fear of obedience that we should. But God, in all of His mercy, sent His Son Jesus into the world. And Jesus lived a perfectly sinless life, righteous and wise in all of His ways. And then Jesus gave Himself up for us, dying on the cross in our place, absorbing the penalty of God's wrath for our sin. And then 3 days later, God raised Jesus from the dead. And in the wisdom of God and in the kindness of God, God offers that all of our foolishness, all of our folly be separated from us and be forgiven when we place our faith in Jesus. And we're brought very much so back to the beginning to trust then in the Lord with all our heart.